They didn't send a warning. They didn't send a demand. They just came, 12 ships the size of mountains, sliding into orbit over Earth like predators who had never once, in 10,000 years, needed to explain themselves to anything they hunted. And in less than 12 hours, that same fleet would be crawling away in lifeboats, leaving their flagship burning in the upper atmosphere, because they made one mistake no species in the galaxy had made in 1,000 years. They forgot to ask what happens when you try to harvest something that refuses to lie down. This is the story of the day humanity was supposed to become a statistic. And instead, it became a warning. It started on a Tuesday. An ordinary, forgettable Tuesday, the kind that gets erased from memory within a week under normal circumstances, traffic on the interstate, coffee going cold on office desks, kids arguing about homework, somebody's dog barking at the mail carrier 3 streets over. Nothing about that morning suggested it would be the last ordinary day the human race would ever have. The first sign came just after 6 a.m. Eastern Time, when an amateur astronomer in rural Ohio named Danny Cho, 19 years old, 3 semesters into community college, the kind of kid who still set an alarm to catch meteor showers, noticed that Jupiter had grown a companion overnight. Not a moon. Not a comet. Something with hard edges, moving with a precision that no natural object in the solar system possessed. He posted about it online at 6:14 a.m. By 6:45, 3 other backyard astronomers across 2 continents had confirmed it. By 7:30, it wasn't a rumor anymore. It was on every news channel on the planet, and the thing in the sky was no longer near Jupiter. It was in Earth orbit. 12 ships. Silent. Enormous. Sitting there like they'd always belonged. There was no invasion fleet posturing, no dramatic broadcast, no demand for surrender. That, more than anything, should have told humanity how this species operated. They didn't need to threaten. They didn't need to negotiate. In their experience, nothing they had ever harvested before required a conversation. The species called themselves the Threnn, though humanity wouldn't learn that name until much later, pieced together from recovered logs. For 11,000 years, by their own historical record, the Threnn had drifted from world to world, always arriving the same way, quietly, patiently, methodically, and always leaving the same way too, with a planet stripped of what they called biological yield. Not conquest. Not colonization. Harvesting. Every world they'd ever visited had gone to sleep under a strange gas deployed from orbit, and had woken up. Those that woke up at all, decades later, hollowed out, their populations reduced to fractions of what they'd been, their genetic diversity and cultural knowledge extracted like marrow from a bone. No species had ever fought back. Not because they lacked courage. Because by the time they understood what was happening, they were already unconscious. That was the plan for Earth too. At 9:02 a.m., the first wave of a fine, silvery mist began drifting down from the ships over Mumbai, then Jakarta, then Sao Paulo. Within minutes, people in the streets were folding gently to the pavement, not screaming, not panicking, just slipping into a sleep so deep it looked almost peaceful. The gas was odorless, painless, and, according to 11,000 years of Threnn data, completely reliable. Except it wasn't. Because 11,000 years of conquest had taught the Threnn everything about biology except one thing: what happens when a species has spent its entire existence being hunted, starved, frozen, flooded, and burned by its own planet, and had learned, generation after generation, to survive anyway. In a small fishing town on the coast of Newfoundland, a lobsterman named Patrick Doyle felt the mist rolling off the water and instead of collapsing, felt his heart start slamming against his ribs like a fist on a door. He didn't understand what was happening to him. He just knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere older than thought, that if he sat down, he wasn't getting back up. So he didn't sit down. He grabbed the radio in his boat's cabin and started shouting into every channel he could reach, telling anyone listening exactly one thing: don't breathe it in if you can help it, and if you already have, fight it. Fight the sleep. Whatever's happening, don't let it win. He had no idea that 4,000 miles away, in a besieged apartment building in Manila, a mother was doing the exact same thing, pinching her own arm hard enough to draw blood, screaming at her children to keep their eyes open, because some deep animal part of her refused to accept the alternative. The Threnn fleet's monitoring systems began registering something they had genuinely never recorded before: statistically significant populations resisting sedation. Not through technology. Not through medicine. Through sheer, furious biological refusal. On the bridge of the Threnn flagship, a commander named Vorash Kathilan, a name that would later be found scrawled in the wreckage logs, though history would remember him simply as the one who ran, stared at the readouts with the kind of confusion that 10,000 years of easy victories does not prepare a person for. "Explain this," he said to his lead biologist, a Threnn named Ithlek who had personally overseen 43 successful harvests. Ithlek stared at the data for a long moment before answering. "Sir, adrenal output in the affected population is exceeding safe parameters for their own physiology. They are essentially poisoning themselves with stress hormones to stay conscious. It's biologically catastrophic. It's also working. How many are resisting? Initial estimate, 6%. Vorash almost laughed. 6%. On any other world, that number would have been 0, and even 6% should have meant nothing. A rounding error. Except 6% of 8 billion people is nearly 500 million human beings standing up when they were supposed to be lying down. And that was only the beginning of what the Threnn didn't understand. Because those 500 million weren't just staying conscious. They were doing something no harvested species in Threnn history had ever managed during an active harvest. They were organizing. Word spread, not through any central government, because most governments were still trying to figure out if what they were looking at was even real, but through ham radio operators, through fishing boat channels, through group chats and encrypted apps and old CB frequencies that hadn't been used in decades. A retired Air Force colonel in Colorado Springs who happened to still have access to a NORAD backup channel started relaying whatever fragments of information he could gather. A teenage gamer in Seoul who'd built his own drone jamming rig for a school robotics project uploaded his schematics online within the hour, and by noon, 3 continents had copies. Humanity, it turned out, had spent the last century preparing for exactly this moment without realizing it. Not preparing for aliens, preparing for chaos. Preparing for disasters, for wars, for pandemics, for blackouts and floods and every conceivable catastrophe that had taught an entire species one brutal lesson over and over again: when the systems fail, you improvise, and you do it together, or you die. By noon, the Threnn had lost their first ship. It happened over the Pacific, where a decommissioned U.S. Navy destroyer, crewed by a skeleton team who'd been doing decommissioning inventory when the invasion began, fired an old anti-ship missile, technology so outdated the Threnn's threat assessment computers hadn't even bothered flagging it as a risk, directly into the underside of a descending harvesting shuttle. The missile wasn't powerful enough to destroy a ship of that size. But it didn't need to be. It clipped an engine housing, sent the shuttle spinning out of control, and it crashed into the ocean, sinking in minutes. It was the first Threnn casualty in over 1,000 years of harvests. And it happened because of a piece of 40-year-old military hardware nobody had bothered to decommission fast enough. Vorash received the report in silence. An anomaly, his tactical officer offered. 2 anomalies, Vorash corrected quietly, thinking of the resistance numbers still climbing on his biological readouts. In one day. He didn't yet understand that the anomalies were about to become the rule. By 2 p.m., something had shifted across the planet that no Threnn calculation could have predicted, because it wasn't a military strategy or a technological advantage. It was something closer to instinct, a species-wide, spontaneous decision, made independently by millions of individuals who had never met each other, that they would rather die fighting than be harvested quietly. In Ukraine, soldiers who had spent years fighting a war on their own soil turned their attention skyward, and started calculating firing solutions on the descending shuttles using math scribbled on the backs of ration boxes. In Texas, ranchers broke out decades-old crop dusters and loaded them with whatever chemical compounds their agricultural supply closets had on hand, hoping something, anything, might disrupt the harvesting gas. In rural India, farmers who had never touched a gun in their lives organized bucket brigades to douse fallen townspeople with water, some folk remedy passed down through generations telling them that cold water shocks the body awake. And to their genuine shock, it worked on some of the milder gas concentrations. None of it was coordinated. None of it followed any strategic doctrine. It was chaos, glorious, furious, defiant chaos, and the Threnn fleet, built on 11,000 years of predictable harvests, had absolutely no model for how to process it. "Sir," Ithlek said, voice tight with something that in a Threnn would have been the beginning of panic, "resistance is no longer isolated to biological anomalies. We are seeing organized paramilitary responses in 17 distinct regions. Weapon platforms are targeting our shuttles directly. We have lost 4 additional vessels. Casualties? 23 crew confirmed dead. 11 missing. 11,000 years, and the Threnn harvest fleet had never lost more than 3 crew members in a single operation, ever, on any world. They had lost 34 in 6 hours. Vorash stood from his command chair and walked to the viewport, looking down at the blue and white marble spinning beneath them, trying to reconcile what his sensors were telling him with everything 11 millennia of successful conquest had taught his people to expect. "Pull back the shuttles in the most heavily contested regions," he ordered. "Redirect harvesting efforts to population centers showing minimal resistance." But there weren't any population centers showing minimal resistance. Not really. Because the resistance wasn't a regional phenomenon. It was a species-wide reflex, and it was accelerating, because humanity was doing something the Threnn had never once seen in 11,000 years of quiet, hopeless surrenders. They were learning in real time. By 4 p.m., a coalition of scientists, some still in pajamas, having been dragged from bed by phone calls at dawn, working now out of university labs and private garages in one particularly well-equipped hackerspace in Berlin, had reverse-engineered enough data from a downed Threnn shuttle to understand the basic chemical structure of the sedative gas. It took them 4 more hours to synthesize a crude counteragent, an inhalant that wouldn't cure exposure but would buy critical minutes of consciousness, enough for people to get to shelter, to fight, to survive. It was shared online, free, within minutes of being tested. No patents. No paperwork. No committees. Just millions of people all over the planet, in a dozen languages, telling each other, "Here, this might help, please survive." Vorash watched the resistance numbers climb past 20%, then 30%, and felt something he hadn't felt in centuries of easy conquest, the cold, creeping certainty that he did not understand his prey at all. "Sir," his weapons officer said quietly, "may I speak freely?" Vorash nodded, not taking his eyes off the planet below. "I don't think this is a species that panics when threatened. I think this is a species that has spent its entire existence being threatened, and has simply never learned how to stop fighting." Vorash said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The officer was right, and it terrified him more than any weapon Earth had fired at his fleet so far. By early evening, the Threnn had lost 11 ships. Not to superior technology, Earth's weapons were laughably primitive by galactic standards, but to sheer, overwhelming, relentless human refusal to stop resisting. Every downed shuttle taught the resistance something new. Every failed harvesting attempt fed data back into the growing, decentralized, wildly improvised human counter-network that had assembled itself out of nothing in less than 12 hours. And then came the moment that would be remembered, retold, mythologized for generations, the moment humanity stopped merely surviving the harvest, and started actively hunting the hunters. A retired engineer in France, working with a team of amateur radio operators and 2 moonlighting aerospace grad students, managed to trace the resonance frequency the Threnn shuttles used for atmospheric stabilization. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't meant to be. But when broadcast at the right amplitude from a network of repurposed cell towers across 3 countries, it disrupted shuttle flight systems just enough to send them tumbling out of formation. Within an hour, the technique had spread to 20 countries. Within 2 hours, the Threnn fleet's remaining shuttles were falling out of the sky faster than they could be recalled. On the bridge of the flagship, Vorash watched his tactical display fill with red markers, downed vessels, lost crews, failed harvests, and understood, with the clarity of a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time, that this was no longer a harvest. It was a rout. "Sir," Iflek said, and for the first time in the entire operation, his voice cracked. "We are down to 40% operational capacity. Resistance efficiency continues to climb. Sir, I don't think this species can be harvested. I think every attempt we make only teaches them how to stop us faster." Vorash closed his eyes. 11,000 years of Threnn history had never encountered a species like this, a species that treated catastrophic invasion not as an ending, but as a problem to be solved, and solved quickly, with whatever tools were on hand, however crude, however desperate. "Signal the fleet," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Withdrawal. All ships. Immediately." "Sir, the flagship's main drive was damaged in the last engagement. We cannot make a clean jump." "Then we don't take the flagship," Vorash said. "Evacuate to the lifeboats. All crew, all shuttles still capable of flight. We are done here." And so it happened, the moment that would define this story for the rest of galactic history, that a fleet which had never lost a single harvest in over 1,000 years, a fleet that had descended on Earth with the absolute, unshakable confidence of predators who had never once needed to fear their prey, found itself abandoning its flagship in the burning upper atmosphere and fleeing the planet in escape pods, scattered across the sky like sparks fleeing a bonfire, chased by nothing more. Advanced and repurposed radio towers, decommissioned missiles, and 8 billion human beings who had simply, collectively, unanimously, refused to lie down and die quietly. By midnight, the skies over Earth were empty again. The 11 surviving Threnn ships had jumped to safety somewhere beyond the edge of the solar system, their crews traumatized in a way no harvest fleet had ever been traumatized before. The flagship burned quietly in orbit for 6 more hours before its structural integrity finally failed, scattering debris that would rain down harmlessly over the Pacific for the next several nights, mistaken by some for an unusually persistent meteor shower. Across the planet, humanity began the slow, exhausted process of counting its losses, tending its wounded, and trying to process what had just happened. Millions had died. That grief would take years, generations, to fully process. But the harvest had failed, and more than that, the fleet responsible for it had fled in terror, something no species in the galaxy had ever managed to make them do. In the weeks that followed, as fragments of Threnn technology were recovered and studied, humanity would learn just how many worlds had come before them, how many civilizations had gone quietly, hopelessly, to their extraction, believing resistance was as impossible as it had always proven to be. And somewhere out in the depths of space, in whatever remained of Threnn command structure, a new designation was added to their star charts, a warning flagged in red across every remaining copy of their 11,000-year harvest log, the third planet of a minor yellow star, marked now not as a target, but as a graveyard for ships. A world where the harvest had come to collect something soft and unprepared, and instead had found something ancient, furious, and utterly unwilling to be anything's easy meal. Humanity didn't celebrate that night. There was too much grief, too many empty chairs at too many tables, for anything as simple as celebration. But in cities and villages and coastlines all over the world, as people held each other in the dark and looked up at a sky that was, for the first time in 12 hours, empty of anything that didn't belong there, a quiet understanding passed between total strangers who would never meet. Whatever came next, whoever else might look at this planet and see an easy harvest, they now knew better than to try it twice. Because the galaxy had just learned, in the space of a single Tuesday, the one lesson every predator eventually learns the hard way, that the most dangerous thing you can ever do is corner something that has spent its entire existence learning how to survive being cornered. And humanity had been cornered by its own planet for 200,000 years, and had never once, not for a single generation, stopped fighting back.